So let's continue where we left off last time. If you remember, all of the modifier system is in its place, and we replaced a bunch of placeholder code to make sure that our exposed status and the muscle status do their thing now, namely giving more damage to their owner, or in the case of the exposed, taking more damage from outside sources. However, with all these dynamic additions to the game, our indicators, namely the CardTooltip system and the enemy intent system, is no longer displaying proper information. They were working fine for static numbers, but whenever we add dynamic modifiers to the mix, we need to rethink how they work. So we'll fix the enemy intent system first. And to do so, let's see or refresh our memory how it works. So let's go back to 2D view and press Ctrl+Shift-O and search for intent. And you can see that we have a scene called intent.ui.tscn. And if we open this up and zoom in, you see that it's pretty simple. We have a texture rec for the icon and we have a label called number here. Pretty simple. We also have the code for this. And the code itself isn't that difficult either. We grab a reference to the icon and the number, and when the intent changes, we refresh and update that information in the UI too, namely changing the icon and setting the label to something else. Right, pretty simple. And you can see that the update intent method itself has an intent resource as a parameter here. So let's press and hold Ctrl and click on this intent keyword. And you can see that the intent resource is pretty basic too. We have two export variables. One is called number, which is funnily enough a string. And we also have an icon, which is a texture, right? So let's change this intent first. And the way we'll do this is for magic numbers, we'll use placeholder values. And in Godot, if you remember, we can do something like this for strings. Whenever we want to dynamically calculate a number and display it in a string, we can just use this %s as a placeholder, and later on in the script somewhere, we can replace it with the value we want. And this is the trick we'll use to fix those numbers. So in the case of the intent, we need to do two things. For the sake of these names to be more representative of what they do, I don't think number does it anymore because, well, yeah, most of the time the intent text is a number, but that's not really true either because in the case of the bad attacks, if you remember, we typed in something like 2x4. So it's more like a string and not a number. So we can rename this to something like base text instead because now it's more a text than a number really. Because most of the time it will be dynamic, so we have to use that placeholder %s string, right? And to make sure that we can keep track of the current intent to kind of separate the two from each other, we'll introduce a new member variable as well, which we'll call current text, and this will be a string too. So these are the little changes we need to make to the intent resource, which is like the bottom of the hierarchy to fix this. Right, we can save this with Ctrl+S. So what does it mean in terms of the intent UI? If we go back to 2D view, I'm not sure if calling this number is the best idea anymore. I think it makes sense to rename this to either just label or text, whichever you think is best. I just go for label here because, yeah, I don't think it's always a number by any means. And if we go back to the script, then we need to fix a couple of things here. First of all, that onReady variable is no longer a number, but we renamed it to label. So we can sort of just change these up. And when we update the intent, right, we have to fix a couple of references. We use number.text and number.visible for the label, and we can just replace those with label because that's the new name we came up with. And in terms of the intent resource itself, we no longer have number and icon, we have base text and icon, right? So if we go back, we can change this from intent.number to intent.currentText, because the current text will be the dynamic one, right? Where we actually replace the placeholder values. And we can replace those with intent.currentText and intent.currentText.length, right? So that's all we really need in the intent and the intent UI. And it's a pretty simple fix, but again, we have the same issue we had before. Just because we fixed it here, that doesn't mean that the game is like magically going to fix everything else for us. we need to think about where we apply and create these intents, right? So where do we use these intents? We have something called enemy actions and enemy AIs, right? So let's go back to 2D view, and under our enemies folder, if we expand it, for example, under the crab, we have a scene called crab enemy AI. If you double click on this one, you see that we have all these enemy actions, right? And all these enemy actions have an intent attached to them. If I click on that attack action, I can click on the intent, and you can see that the base text became empty now because we sort of changed this in the resource itself. And for the crab's attack, it's pretty simple because we actually want to just display one number, right? And that number will be dynamic because, okay, the crab does 6 damage by default or whatever. But if the player has the exposed status or someone buffs the crab, then the damage will be more. So instead of saying 6 here or 7, what we can do is we can type in %s, right? As a placeholder for now. And again, you could do the same for the blocking actions, but for the sake of this demo or this season, block is not a modifiable resource in the game. So in the case of the block intent, we can just type the number back in, like so, in both cases, and we're good to go. We can save the crab enemy AI by pressing Ctrl S. And we kind of need to do the same for the bat enemy AI as well. So double click the bat enemy AI, and we have the attack action here. And if we click on the intent, it's empty again. Right. We know that the damage is 4 for the bat attack action, but we also know that the bats attack twice. So the base text in this case will be 2x, and this is where we put the placeholder like so. Why? Because it will always be 2x something, but the actual damage, which is 4 by default, is dynamic, right? For the same reason. It can be buffed, or the target can have the exposed status, yada, yada, yada. So we say that this will be a placeholder value we'll replace later on, but by default, we can say that it's 2x something. For the block action though, it blocks for 4. And again, in my example, in this case, block is not modifiable, so we can leave it as just plain text of 4. Right. So let's save both of these with Ctrl S, and we're getting closer to actually fixing the issue, but the problem is we need to put something instead of this placeholder, right? Because for right now, we just say that, okay, it will be 2x %s, but whatever that %s is, somewhere through code, we need to actually replace it with whatever value we want to. So where do we do this? How do we create these enemy actions? Well, if you think about it, we have a base class, right? Called enemy action. So let's go back to the script tab, press Ctrl-Alt-O, and search for enemy action.gd. And right now, that's all the code we have here. We have the class name, we have an enum, we have all these export variables, and we have 2 methods. One is called performable, and one is called perform action. Well, that's not going to do it anymore. We also need a new function for all the enemy actions to actually update the intent. And this will be a method similar to perform action in a sense that all the different enemy actions we code in the game can override this function to provide their custom handling of updating the intent text. The default version will be pretty simple. So the default case will be, we just say that the intent's current text property, which is the member variable we introduced, will be equal to the base text. And that's perfectly fine for all the blocking actions, right? Because there are no dynamic values there, so we don't actually want to update anything. However, for the attack actions, we want to take all the modifiers into consideration when we update them. So they, and by they I mean the attack enemy actions, in the case of the crab and the bat, can actually override this to provide their own custom implementation of updating the intent. But before we actually do that in the specific enemy actions, let's think about the future and adding more content to the game. This is again something we can do in the template because we also have a template script for enemy actions. So if we press Ctrl-Alt-O and search for action template or something like that, you see that we'll have this enemy action template.gd. And in the default template, the only thing we have is overriding that perform action method. That's fine, but we might also want to provide sort of a template to show the other developers or to remind ourselves how we can provide our own custom implementation of updating the intent text. In this case, I even included some comments explaining what this method does, and it says that if the enemy has dynamic intent text, you can override the base behavior here. For example, for attack actions, the player's damage taken modifier modifies the resulting damage number. So you can do something like update intent text, grab the target as the player, and grab the player's modifier handler, take some whatever arbitrary value. This can be an export variable or whatever you like, apply or get whatever modified value you want. And here's the magic, right? I can say that the intent resources base text will have one placeholder in this case. For example, for the bad enemy, let's just see what we have. Right, for the bad attack action, I have this string 2x%s. And if I want to replace this, I can create my custom update intent text method and say that grab the base text, which is this one, and overwrite this %s placeholder with the modified damage we just calculated, right? And we set this to the intent's current text property, and this is the one we'll use to render the intent in the intent UI, right? And go back to the intent UI, you can see that we set the label's text value to the intent's current text. So we can do something like this to actually set the current text to a dynamic value. Pretty cool. So we have this in the enemy action template, and it's one we can use over and over again for enemy action attacks. So it's pretty cool to have this as a template whenever we want to override it. If you don't need it, like in the case of the blocking actions, you can always just select this and delete this whenever we create a new one, right? So let's save this with Control S. And let's not forget that we actually need to override this in the case of the bad attack action and the crab attack actions. So let's press Ctrl+O and search for crab attack action, and press it again and search for bad attack action 2. So we have both scripts open. And here we need to do a similar thing we did with the template, right? We don't really want to change anything regarding the action itself. Instead, what we want to do is under the perform action method, we want to override the update intent text as well, right? And we can do the same thing we did in the template, grab the player's modifier handler, get the modified value, and we'll pass on this damage export variable we have for the action, get the modified value based on the player's damage taken modifier, and just update the intent's current text property. Pretty easy, right? And we can actually copy this and do the same for the crab attack action, because a crab also has this damage export variable. So the only thing we need to do is to copy this over, because we want the same logic to apply for the intent of the crab enemy. Right. So we're almost done with this. Why do I say almost? We updated the intent resource to handle this placeholder logic, right? We updated the intent UI to actually take the current text from the intent resource, which is the placeholder one. We also updated the enemy action to make sure that it has this default update intent text method for actions where we don't want to override the default text or the default behavior. We also updated the template to make sure that when we create new ones, we don't have to write this logic from scratch all the time. And we kind of implemented this for the crab and the bat. What's the problem here? Well, we have this update intent text method for all the enemy actions, but we actually never call this, if you think about it, right? So where do we call this? Where's the place where we want to say that, hey, okay, we should update the intent text? Well, I'd say we have two possible valid candidates. One is the enemy script itself, and the other one is the enemy handler, right? Because those two are kind of responsible for anything to do with the enemies, really, in our game, in our battle. So let's press Ctrl+O and start with enemy.gd, and let's see what we got here. We have a couple of methods. So if we scroll all the way up, we have a very interesting piece of code here called setCurrentAction, which is a setter function for setting the current enemy action we want to perform, right? And what we do here is we call the intent UI's update intent method and pass this current action intent parameter. And that's perfectly fine. And we actually want to do this. But at the same time, before we actually do this, we want to update the text, right? So we can do something like current action that update intent text, right? This is the new method we just created for enemy actions. If we go back, see, that's the one we want to override for the attack actions. So that kind of solves our problem. So to show you what's the problem with this, even though it's almost perfect, we need to actually find a way to test this. And if you remember, we want to update based on the damage taken modifier for the player. So we can go back to the player script after saving this with Control S and get back our testing code we had earlier to make sure that we apply the expose status to the player so we can test if the enemy intents are updating properly or not. That testing code was something like this, preloading the expose status, setting the duration, and adding it to the status handler. Right, so now we will be able to test this. If I go to battle, you can see that the crab intends to block for itself, so it will remain 6. Oh, and now you see it in action. So what happens is, it should be 7, right? But if I have the expose status, this will update the intent to become 10. If I pass my turn, indeed it becomes 10. But in this specific case, you cannot see what's the problem we have. So let's run the game one more time and see if we run into the issue this time. Okay, probably we will. So we have our bad enemies, and instead of 2 times 4, it deals 2 times 6 because we take 50% more damage. Perfect. So let me kill the other one. Right, it attacks again, so I take 12 damage still. Right, see, that's the problem. Even though the exposed effect expired on me, it still displays 2 times 6. And if I defend myself for 10, I'll only take 8 damage. And then it goes to 2 times 4. So it wasn't the problem with the status effects because I only took 8 damage when it was expired, but it was a problem with the intent UI. So for whatever reason, it didn't refresh, right? Let us debug what's happened here. So if I close the game and go to enemy.gd, we say that when we set the current action of the enemy, we update the intent text and update the intent UI, right? See, the problem is related to the flow of the game, right? So the enemy decided that they will attack next turn. And when they decided to do that, I still had the exposed effect on. But after my turn started, at the start of my turn, the duration of the exposed was reduced by 1 and it expired. However, the enemy's intended action was already decided when that happened, right? So that setter function wasn't called. And it wasn't supposed to be called because the enemy's action for the next turn is decided before I take my turn. So the game itself is working properly, but we actually want to update this intent thing. So we want to sort of do the same logic, updating the intent text and updating the intent UI each turn, even after the player draws their whole hand, right? Basically, because otherwise we will only update the intent when I finished my turn and the enemies decide what they do for next turn. And that's too late in this one case, right? Hopefully that makes sense. And it's a pretty easy fix. What we need to do is we need to perform the same logic when the player has drawn their hand. So for all enemies basically. But to do so, it makes sense to extract out this logic because we don't just want to do this anymore when we set the enemy's action, but we want to do this otherwise too, right? When the player's hand will be drawn. So sort of to expose this method to the outside world, what we can do is we can create a new method under update enemy, for example, and we can call this new method update intent. And we'll do the same thing. We'll provide a safety check if we have a current action and then do the same 2 things, updating the intent text and then updating the intent UI itself. And actually in the setter function, we no longer need to do this. Again, we don't have to repeat ourselves. We can just say update intent like so. So far, so good, but we still do the same thing. So how do we do this when the player's hand is drawn? We could certainly do it here in the enemy script, but the enemy itself is much more considered to be like a visual representation, right? It's up to personal preference, but I think it makes more sense to actually do this in the enemy handler script instead. So let's press Ctrl-Alt-O and open the enemy handler script. And right now, if we take a look at our callbacks, we have the enemy action completed, the enemy died, and the enemy status is applied callbacks. So we actually don't connect to the event when the player's hand is drawn, but if we open up events.gd by pressing and holding Control and clicking on this one, we have a player-related event called player hand drawn, which is emitted once when the whole hand of the player has been drawn and you are ready to start your turn, right? So if we go back to enemyhandler.gd, in the ready callback, we can actually connect to that signal, saying that on events.playerHandDrawn, we want to connect to our own callback function called onPlayerHandDrawn. And this callback, if we scroll all the way down, will be pretty simple. What we need to do is we need to iterate through all the children we have, which are all enemies, and call this new update intent method. I know it's a lot of hassle for one minor bug to fix, but it's still a bug, right? We want the enemy intent to be updated and dynamic all the time. So now if we run the game and I manage to display the same bug again, which I'm pretty sure I will be able to, I'll take 2 times 6, I'll take 2 times 6 again, and see when after I've drawn my hand, now it will update to 2 times 4 after the status effect expired. And indeed, if I block for 10, 2 block remains at the end of the turn. So with that little fix, we actually fixed the whole enemy intent system, and now we can handle all the magic numbers we want to per enemy action. So in the case of blocking or other intents where you only have icons, for example, you don't have to deal with this because you have the default one, right? So you can just delete the whole code from the template when you create a new enemy action. But if you have magic numbers involved, then you can sort of form your own logic if you want to, like we did in the crab attack action, by overriding this update intent text method, and the system will handle everything else for you. Pretty cool, right? So that's the enemy intent system done. The next one on the menu is the card tooltips. So the next one on the menu are the card tooltips. What we'll do will be pretty similar to what we did with enemy intents, with some small modifications here and there. So again, we'll start at the very bottom at Card.gd, which is our custom resource. So let's press Ctrl-Alt-O and search for Card.gd. Right, so in the case of the cards, with tooltips, we already have that multi-line export variable called tooltip text for all the BB code we want to have and so on. That's perfectly fine. We kind of want to do the same thing we did with the enemy actions. We want to provide like custom methods you can override for specific cards where you want to use a magic number, while at the same time also providing a default value or a default kind of tooltip we can use where you don't want to rely on magic numbers. And for this purpose, we'll have 2 new methods. Actually, one of them will be called getDefaultTooltip, which returns a string, and it's a pretty straightforward method. We just return that tooltip text. And in the case of getUpdatedTooltip, again, we return a string from this method, but this one will be where we actually use magic numbers, but by default, we just return the tooltip text all the same. But here we have actually 2 parameters because we need the player modifiers and the enemy modifiers sometimes. So for example, if you remember where we attacked the crab and dealt 15 damage, we did 10 by adding together the base 6 and the 4 flat extra damage I got from the muscle status effect. But since the enemy also had an exposed status, another 50% modifier was applied as they took the damage. So in this case, I want the updated tooltip to be 15, right? So I might need both of the modifiers when I actually determine the updated magic number. So this is why we have this method. So far, so good. That's the only thing we need here. We can save this with Ctrl-S. However, if we have this, then again, it's a good idea to change the template before we forget it. So in the future, when we add new content, it will be much easier to do so. So let's press Ctrl+Alt+O and search for CardTemplate.gd. And here, besides the apply effects method, we can sort of list the two new methods, the get default tooltip and the get updated tooltip. I'll just use the same method we have in the cards class, so nothing really fancy here. And if you don't want to override these, then you can just delete them anyways, right? You still have them in Card.gd. But if you do want to override them, then at least you'll have the method signature given to you in the proper way. Cool. So the card template is updated. What's next? Well, since we'll use the same sort of placeholder method for magic numbers, that %s inside the string, we might as well update the tooltips themselves for the card resources. So let's go back to 2D view. And in the file system, to make our life easier, we can just filter for warrior underscore because all the cards start with this name, and double click on the resources one by one. And maybe I can make this a bit wider. And you'll see that under tooltip text, we have deal 6 damage, right? And instead of 6, I can just type in %s as a placeholder, right? So we'll have a magic number here. And we kind of have to do the same for all of those where we have one magic number. In the case of the big slam, the damage itself is a magic number, but the 2 exposed is not, right? That's fixed, that's the same all the time. And for the block, we could leave that as is, but just to show you how we can use the default method as well, we can replace this by %s, even though it's not a magic number in this case, because we have no way to like increase the block we get from this card. This is just for demonstration purposes. And for the slash, we can kind of do the same. Instead of saying 4 damage flat, we can replace this with %s, right? What about warrior true strength? Well, this tooltip doesn't really have magic numbers, so we can leave it as is. It will be perfectly fine. So with all those resources modified, let's press Ctrl+S to save them. And now we have the basis of the system ready. And again, we have to build all the way up to the highest point of the level to fix everything in the game. And as per usual, we start from the bottom and work our way upwards. So the next logical thing would be to actually change the script for the cards as well, right? Because just because we sort of inserted that %s and provided a way for card resources to have magic numbers in their tooltips, we actually have no implementation of them yet. So let's open up those scripts one by one. So I double click on warrior X attack, big slam, block, slash, and true strength as well, and see what we need to do here one by one. So true strength is probably the easiest one because we actually don't have to change anything, right? We don't have magic numbers, and even though we don't have those two new methods here, the default tooltip and the updated tooltip, it doesn't really matter because in Card.gd we do have them defined by default, right? And they both just return the tooltip text, which is perfectly fine in this case, as it has no magic number. So we can close this one. Let's move on to the warrior slash next. And in the case of the warrior slash, we actually need to provide both of those methods. We'll have one for the default tooltip and we'll have one for the updated tooltip. Let's see what the difference is between them. So the default tooltip will be just the default tooltip text, which is the BB code we just saw earlier. And we sort of take the first placeholder and put the base damage inside of it. Why do we need two separate methods though? What's the reason? Let me show you. So if we click on warrior slash, you'll see that the tooltip text of that resource will be this one, right? So we have one placeholder here with the %s, and we want the base damage 4 to be sort of like put inside or instead of this %s here, right? But in the case of the updated tooltip, it's a bit more complicated, even though the end result is the same. We grab the tooltip text and take that modified damage, whatever that is, and replace that placeholder value with it. So how do we arrive at that modified damage? Well, first we get the modified value of the damage dealt modifier from the player modifiers. And if we have enemy modifiers as well, then we get the modified value from the enemy modifier's damage taken method. Pretty straightforward, right? So why two separate methods? Well, it's because we don't always want to use the magic number with all the modifiers taken into consideration, right? In the battle, when I hover over a card or when I target an enemy with a card, I definitely want to see the modified value. However, if I click on the card in the battle reward screen when I draft a new card to my deck, or when I view my deck during scrolling the map, I don't actually have player modifiers or enemy modifiers because these concepts only exist when I'm in a battle. So whenever I don't want to take the modifiers into consideration, I can provide a default tooltip which will only use the base damage, right? So whenever I take a look at what this card does from the deck view, it still wouldn't say %s because I replaced that %s with the base damage. And this will always be the base damage no matter what's going on inside the battle, if I'm even at a battle, right? Hopefully that makes sense. So in this case, we actually want to separate those two cases from each other because card tooltips exist outside of battle contexts as well. So for the warrior slash, that's all we need to do. And the warrior block will be even simpler. So in the case of the warrior block, as sort of a placeholder code, we can do something like this, right? Where we replace the tooltip text placeholder, which was a %s, with the base block we have. See, the problem is we don't have a variable like this because I've used a literal here, a constant value, saying that when I apply the effects, I want the block effects amount to be 5. And you can sort of see the reason why I included this error here. It's not a good idea in your code to use constants like this. You can always use member variables, because in the future you might want to reuse that value. And that's absolutely the case here. So what we can do is we can create a new member variable, call this base block, and assign that same value to it. And now all the errors will disappear and I can use the same one right here. So instead of typing 5 everywhere, because what's the problem with typing 5 everywhere? It's the same as doing this, right? So the problem is when I design the game and I want to make some changes or test some balance changes and I decide that, okay, this card should only apply 4 block instead of 5 because it's too OP, then I need to replace this in 3 different places, right? And also I need to look over the code to see what it does. And it's like a mental effort to decide where to override these values. Even though it's not a big mental effort, it's still an effort, nevertheless. So if we instead create these member variables at the top, I know that whenever I want to change a card and I only want to tinker with the values, I can always be sure that if I open up whatever card, I'll have all the numbers I need to tweak at the top, and I don't even have to look at the code, which is much less mental effort if you think about it. So there are a lot of benefits using member variables like this, and this is why I wanted to use this blocking card as an example. Right, so the big slam will be pretty similar. We override both of those methods. So the default tooltip will be the tooltip text where the placeholder is replaced with the base damage. And again, for the updated tooltip, we take the player modifiers, damage dealt modifier, and the enemy modifiers, damage taken modifier if we have an enemy modifier, and then take that double modified damage and replace the placeholder value in the tooltip text. And finally, we do the same with the axe attack. So this is the last place where we need to modify the code. Again, we provide the same 2 methods and use the same logic. Now that we are done with all the cards scripts, we can save this with Ctrl+S and think about what we need to do next. Are we done? Is there anything else we need to do? Well, we have a problem, right? Even though we took a lot of time and put in a lot of work to create this new system so we can use the magic numbers in the placeholder values, but still we don't actually use them anywhere. So we have this get updated tooltip or get default tooltip method for all cards in the game, but we actually never call these methods yet, right? So if I run the game now and take a look at my deck of cards, whenever I click on any of those, I will have those %s values because they will never be replaced, right? As long as I don't call those methods. So the big question is this: where do we want to call these methods? That's the question we need to ask ourselves, right? And even if we know where we call these methods, okay, let's say we know where we call these methods, right? One of those places is called the card tooltip or something like that. So let's go back to 2D view, press Ctrl+Shift-O and search for tooltip. And now we have tooltip and card tooltip pop-up.tscn. whichever we want to use, it doesn't really matter. Let's start with Tooltip. Okay, so this is the one we use inside the battle, right? And the tooltip itself is not really concerned with whatever we want to display. It's just sort of a framework, right? As we have a rich text label and we have a texture, right? So this definitely doesn't know the context of cards or whatever. It's way more dumb than that. So where do we use this tooltip is the question. Well, let's search for tooltip, right? Investigate what's going on here. We have all these matches for the cards we just created because I didn't check case sensitive. Or you know what? It's much easier to redo the search, press Ctrl-Shift-F again, and just tick match case, right? Okay, so we have Tooltip.gd. That doesn't really count since it's the one we use. CardTooltip popup is different because that's the one we use with deck view and the card rewards screen. So we can collapse those for now. Okay, so it seems like we don't really use it anywhere, right? So what's going on here? Well, that didn't really help, but we know that we sort of use this inside the battle, right? So let's open the battle scene then. Let's press Ctrl-Shift-O and search for battle.tscn. And here we do have a tooltip. Okay, so far so good. So when do we change the value of this is the question, right? So we have our battle UI script. That's the parent of it, so it might make sense to check this one out. Again, if I start scrolling here, there's not much to go with, right? So, again, we're kind of stuck with this. So if it's not orchestrated by the battle UI, then what choices do I have here? Where do I look? So we know what information gets passed here, right? We'll see an icon and a tooltip description. Another way to go about this is to think about when the tooltip will be displayed. When does it happen? Oh, it happens when I hover over a card. Cool. So when do I know when the tooltip should be displayed? What scene is concerned with cards? Well, if you remember all the way back to season 1, we have a scene called CardUI. And that's the one we use for cards inside the game. Okay, so let's open the script up for CardUI. And in CardUI, we have this on-mouse entered and on-mouse exited callbacks. And what we do is we delegate that logic to the card state machine. So whichever state can handle actually hovering over the card or moving the mouse away from the card. Right. So when do we display the tooltip? Probably as soon as we hover over the card, right? So which is the default state of the card? Well, it's the base state. So if we open up CardBaseState.gd, you can finally see what happens, right? On the on-mouse entered callback, we emit this card tooltip requested signal. And what we do is we take the card resources icon and the tooltip text, and we say to that tooltip scene that, okay, you need to display this information. And this was fine up until this point where we realized that, okay, hold on, we need to actually replace those placeholder values somewhere, right? So we finally found that we need to change the base state and or the card UI script to better accommodate to these changes we made. Right. So in the base state, we have this card tooltip requested signal, which we emit. Absolutely fine. This is the place where we want to do it. See, the problem is, how do we get the updated tooltip information with all the dynamic values replacing the placeholders? We just need to call the card resources update method, right? Update tooltip method. Well, see, here's the problem. If we open up that Card.gd script we just changed, yeah. Only thing we need to do is to call this getUpdatedTooltip method, and this will return the string we want. This is what we implemented for all the different cards. There's just one tiny problem here. We need 2 arguments for this. One for the player modifiers and one for the enemy modifiers we have. Now, we can certainly do this inside the base state of the card, but I don't think personally that this logic should reside here. It was hard to find in the first place, right? Where we need to change the whole thing. So I don't think it's strictly related to the card being in a base state. Sure, the logic itself of requesting the updated tooltip is, but I would delegate this logic back to the card UI script instead of relying on the base state to handle getting the enemy modifier and calling this method. So instead we can do a slight refactor here. Let me show you what. We can create two new small methods here. One will be called getActiveModifiers. And what this does is it returns a modifier handler, which we can grab from the enemy. If you remember, this CardUI.gd has a targets array which keeps track of the nodes we hover this card over when we aim for a target, right? And what we do is we provide a safety check first. If the target is empty, or we have multiple targets, or the first target in the array is not an enemy, then we can return null because we can't get a valid modifier handler anyway. But if the targets array has only one target and it is an enemy, then we can grab that target and return its modifier handler. Okay, so this is just a utility method we'll use in the next method, which is called requestTooltip. And what this does is it gets the active enemy modifiers, which is the method we just implemented, and then gets the updated tooltip. And to do that, we call the card resources getUpdatedTooltip method and pass in the player modifiers, which we already have from the hand, if you remember, because we needed this earlier. And now we have access to the enemy modifiers as well. So when we have both of those, we can call this getUpdatedTooltip method, replace the placeholders with the actual values based on the logic of that specific card, and then we can emit the same signal. The icon remains the same, but instead of providing the base tooltip like we did before, we pass this updated tooltip, and then we're good to go. You can see that we have this error message here, and again, this can be solved just by going to project and reload current project. It says that we cannot infer the type of that variable because the return value doesn't have a set type, but this is absolutely not true. If we go to Card.gd, this method does have a set return type, which is a string. Okay, so this is just an editor thing. For whatever reason, it didn't refresh all the tokens or all the metadata it uses to parse the code. If you go to project, reload current project, everything will be fine. Okay, so we can save this because that's all we need in CardUI.gd. But back in the CardBaseState.gd, we no longer need to emit this signal here. We can just do CardUI.requestTooltip, right? Because this is the new method we just implemented here, this one. So we still have the logic here because we want to request the tooltip when we hover over a card in the base state, but instead of doing all that logic right here, I don't think it really makes sense. Instead, what we do is we delegate this whole logic to the CardUI script instead. Pretty cool. So we're good to go, right? Let's save all the scripts we have and test this. If we go to a battle, you can see that sort of the base numbers are working, right? I have 6 damage with my attacks, and if I use them, I do 6 damage. But let's see what happens when I apply the expose status. So I play the card, and now it should take 50% more damage, right? So if I hover over the attack, it will say 6 damage, but when I drag this over the crab enemy, it still says 6 damage. Why? Even though it does 9. What happens here? Well, think about this for a second. When do we refresh the tooltip of this card? When we hover over it, right? Okay, so when I hover over a card, do I have an enemy selected? No, I don't. So that's the problem. We don't have an enemy modifier, but that doesn't mean that what we did was pointless, right? Because if I play my power card here and start to gain muscle, you can see when I hover over the attack, it says 8 instead of 6, which is super cool. So I can play my block cards, and you can see that indeed I deal 8 damage. And you can see that my AoE attack will display 8 because 4 plus 4 is 8. And my basic attack will display 10 because 6 plus 4 is 10. So it kind of works for player modifiers, but it doesn't really work for enemy modifiers yet. So what's the problem here? Well, the problem is when we call this getActiveModifiers, the target's array will be empty because when I hover over the base card, right? When the mouse enters the card in the base state, I'm pretty sure that I can't target an enemy at the same time. So what we want to do is we want to call this request tooltip method when I actually hover over an enemy as well. Because when I hover over an enemy with a card, then I will get the enemy modifiers and the card tooltip will display properly. The question is, where do we make this change? Well, we have a script and a scene called CardTargetSelector, right? Remember this one? And in the CardTargetSelector, we have two callback methods when the RIA enters or exits the CardTargetSelector node. And if that happens, we take the current card, which is conveniently enough a CardUI node, and append to the targets array of that CardUI node, or when we actually exit it, then we erase that area from the targets array. And what we need to do is pretty simple. In both cases, we can just type in current card.request tooltip and do the same here as well. So with these little small changes, whenever we hover over an enemy or remove our cursor or aiming node from the enemy, we call this request tooltip method to make sure that it updates accordingly. So let's see what these changes do. Okay, perfect. So you can see that in this case, I'll deal 4 damage and apply 2 exposed. Perfectly fine, and I do it. Let's block for some. Next turn starts, right? Because I have the base damage of 6 for this attack, or 4 for this one. When I use that single targeted spell, you can see that it still says 6 damage, but if I hover over the enemy, it updates to 9, right? Because when I hover over it, the CardTargetSelector will add it to the current targets, and then I call the request tooltip method. Pretty cool. And if I cancel it or sort of just move outside of this range, you'll see that it updates accordingly. Goes from 6 to 9, from 9 to 6. Pretty cool. If I cancel it, the tooltip gets hidden, and indeed I do 9 damage. Pretty awesome, right? So we're kind of done, right? Our card tooltips are now dynamic, and everything is fine and dandy. Well, kind of, but no. You see, yeah, we're done with one kind of card tooltips. The ones inside the battle now work properly. But what about the deck view and the card rewards view? Here we still have that %s for all the cards that indeed have a placeholder value in their tooltips. So we're done, but at the same time, we're not done yet. Let's see how we can fix this. Because if I win as well and try to add a new card, you can see that in the card reward screen, I still have that %s, and the same goes for the deck view. Right. So how do we do this? Again, we might go ahead and explore it together where we need to update this. Let me close up these scenes. And let's just kind of explore what we do here. So I have my run scene open and we have our deck view here. And yeah, that's the deck view. Awesome. So let's open the deck view scene. And if we take a look at the deck view scene, it opens up this card pile view scene we have, right? We have the grid container, the scrolling, the background, and if we scroll all the way up, we have this card tooltip pop-up. And the card tooltip pop-up is where we actually display the card and the description connected to that card. Right, so let's open up the card tooltip pop-up, right? We have that card description rich text label here, and let's see what we do in the script to make sure that we can understand what's going on better, because this might be the place we need to change. Right, so how do we show the card description in the card tooltip pop-up? Well, the script is pretty basic, so probably we'll have no trouble finding that, right? We have a hide tooltip and the show tooltip method. So for the show tooltip, what we do is we create a new card menu UI, we connect to a signal and set the card description rich text label nodes text property to the card's tooltip text, which is kind of fine, but at the same time it isn't, because this will always include the placeholder value, right? We definitely need to change this. The question is, what do we change this to? Well, we have that update tooltip method or get updated tooltip method, but see, the problem is here we are absolutely not concerned with modifiers at all. And that method requires a player modifier and an enemy modifier to work, just like we saw it with the CardTargetSelector and the CardUI, right? So that is for the context of the battle. But this is why we have another method, right? If you remember, we have a method called card.getDefaultTooltip. And in the case of default tooltip, we either use the tooltip text as is, but if you take a look at, for example, the /card, remember what we did there? We said that the default tooltip will be the tooltip text with the base damage replacing that placeholder %s. And this is exactly what we need here, because to call this, we don't need to have access to modifiers, because in the card tooltip pop-up, which happens in card rewards and in the deck view, is not really concerned with modifiers, so we can just call this get default tooltip instead. And that's all we need to change for this to work for the deck view or the card pile view and the battle reward screen. So let's save this with Control S, and with this one little piece of code changing, if we run the game, in theory, we fixed all the issues we had with card tooltips. So if I open up my deck here, you can see that I no longer have placeholder values. The default numbers will be used instead. So if I go to a battle, you can see that this still works as intended. And I can maybe play the game for a while to see if everything works as it should. Okay, so now I can play my power card here, even though I take quite a bit of damage. Okay, so what happens here? All of my AoE cards will say deal 6 damage instead of 4 because I have 2 muscle, right? But if I click on my deck, this AoE card will still say deal 4 damage to all enemies because it uses the default tooltip, right? It's not concerned with the modifiers we have during a battle. Pretty awesome. So if I play this, it deals 6 damage. I can end my turn again. Okay, draw my cards. And you can see that these ones are actually updated according to my muscle, but the deck view and the discard pile view is not concerned with this at all. Pretty awesome. So if I kill this bat, I'm victorious. And if I draft a new card, these descriptions again work perfectly fine because we opted to use the default tooltip, and that's why we have 2 separate methods for the cards. Pretty cool. It was long and difficult to fix those, and these are the biggest refactors by far we have to do in this project in both seasons. See, introducing modifiers, status effects is always a complex topic, and you need to carefully think about how it interacts with all the present systems in the game. In this case, probably fixing the intent and the card tooltip was actually harder than creating the modifier system itself, but it's really an essential part of the game because from a UX perspective, it's much more pleasant to play the game if you have this dynamic data updated in real time when you play the game. Hopefully you learned something along the way with this refactoring and it wasn't too difficult. If you get stuck, I recommend rolling back the video and watching this multiple times because it might be easy to get lost in the details, even though I tried my best to take the time to explain every single detail. Anyways, we still have one more thing to do in this video, and that is to implement a new feature finally, which are the status tooltips. So that's what we'll do next. If you like my content, please consider checking out my Ko-fi page where you can donate one time or become a member and get early access to all my content and videos. Okay, so how the status tooltip business is going to work. First of all, if we go back to the script tab, press Ctrl+Alt+O and search for status.gd, you might remember from last time that we actually included a tooltip property under status visuals and provided a get tooltip method, which just returns the tooltip as a string. And I said that this is sort of a preparation to when we actually do status tooltips. So we already prepared the status resource to handle tooltips, so you can pat ourselves in the shoulder. Pretty cool. However, if we go back to 2D view, collapse the character folders and go under statuses, and double click one of those status resources, the tooltip is actually pretty lame because we just said to do under all of those statuses. So let's replace those tooltips with actual text. So in the case of exposed, we can say something like exposed : takes 50% more damage for %s turns. And you can see 2 things here basically. When you want to actually display a % sign in a string where you use placeholders, you have to type in %% because % is sort of a special character used for placeholders by default. So by typing %%, we say that, okay, we actually want to display one single % sign in the string. And it does have a magic number, right? Because whenever I click on the status handler, I want the tooltip to show how many turns are left from the status. So this will be dynamic as well. So just like we did with cards and intents, we can say that, okay, this will be a number we have to replace later on. Cool. So let's move on to the muscle next. Again, we start with a to-do, and this will have a magic number 2. In this case, we just say muscle colon attacks deal %s more damage, where %s will be the amount of stacks we currently have, right? And finally, we can do true strength form, where we also said to do, but we actually could have done this because there are no magic numbers in this. We just say true strength form at the start of its turn gains 2 muscle, which is perfectly fine. That 2 is a static number. It's not dynamic. Right. So we have the basis. We have all the tooltips ready and the status resort is prepared to be used for statuses. And we also have a default method called getTooltip, which we can override in our custom status code. So let's save this with Control S and open up the scripts we have for the statuses. So double click on expose.gd, muscle.gd, and truestrengthform.gd as well. Okay, so true strength form is probably the easiest one to do because we actually don't want to do anything. Even though we won't provide this get tooltip override, it's still not a problem because if you remember in status.gd, we do have a default one, which just returns the string as is. And in this case, that's perfectly fine. However, for the muscle, we do want to have that magic number embedded inside the string by replacing the placeholder. So we'll just override the getTooltip method, and it will be significantly easier than with cards because we don't have to take any modifiers into consideration, at least for now. We can just say tooltip %stacks, and instead of that %s, the number of stacks will appear. And in the case of exposed, we kind of want to do the same, but instead of using the stacks, we display the duration of the remaining turns. Right. That's all the setup we need really for this to work. So let's press Ctrl S to save everything. And if we go back to 2D view, we actually need to design the scenes, the new scenes we have. If you remember from the architecture overview, we have 2 new scenes. One is called StatusTooltip, which will display the tooltip for one specific status, and we'll have the status view, which will be like a full screen pop-up window displaying all the statuses that we want to display either on the player or the enemy. Right, so let's create a new scene by clicking on the plus sign here. And in the case of the status tooltip, we'll choose another node as the root node, and we'll use an HBox container for this one. Double click on this and rename it to status tooltip. And the status tooltip will have 2 children nodes. So click on the plus sign or press Ctrl A, and we'll add one texture rect for the icon. Select the status tooltip again, click on the plus sign, and we'll add a simple label for the actual text. If you want to, you can use rich text label as well. I opted for label here because status descriptions might be longer, and with simple labels, you have an auto wrap property, which is not available for rich text labels at the moment. With this done, we can rename both of those nodes. Actually, this can stay label, but let's rename this to icon. And let's zoom in to see what we have here. For the status tooltip itself, go to layout and set a custom minimum size of 150, maybe on the X to make sure that it's wide enough. Yeah, something like that. For the icon, we can load something from the texture to see how it looks like from the art folder. Maybe that exposed, and you can see that it kind of looks awkward. So the expand mode should be ignore size, and the stretch mode should be keep aspect centered. And under layout, we can set this to 10 pixels by 10 pixels, like so. And for the label, we can actually type in some text to see how this looks like, and maybe use the exposed text we have, something like takes 50% more damage from attacks for whatever amount of turns. And this is way too long for my liking. So first of all, let's change the vertical and horizontal alignments to center. Or maybe in this case, just the vertical one. It can stay on the left side. And set the auto wrap mode to vert. And you instantly see that it kind of looks weird, right? And we also have a node configuration warning, which says that labels with auto wrapping enabled must have a custom minimum size. Okay, so let's just do that, right? Under layout, we can set the custom minimum size to 110 or something like that. But we can also make sure that it actually fits the whole remaining space. So under container sizing, we can expand it horizontally like so, right? Because we have the minimum size set for the status tooltip, the icon will take 10 pixels. And then we can just say that, okay, the remaining space should be filled by this label. Pretty cool. So I don't think there's much else we need to change here. Maybe we can reset the height of this because it's way bigger than it needs to be. So under transform for the status tooltip, we can click on the revert icon to revert the size of this. And also, if you don't like the gap between the icon and the text, you can change the theme overrides separation property here, but I kind of like the default one. I think that's a healthy space between the icon and the text. So I'll just leave this as is. So the scene is unsaved, and we can save this by pressing Ctrl S. We can go under scenes, maybe UI, and save this as StatusTooltip.gd. And actually attach the script to it to make sure that it works like we want it to. Click on the attach script. StatusTooltip.gd is fine. Object empty is fine. Create this new script and see how we can code this. I promise it's not a complicated script. So first of all, we'll need a custom class name called StatusTooltip. Then we'll have one export variable, which is called status, and it's a status resource with a setter function attached to it. Then we'll have two onReady variables, one for the icon and one for the label. And then we need to provide that setter function called setStatus. Here, just because export variables can be set before the node is ready in the scene tree, we check if the node is ready or not. And if it's not, then we await for the ready signal. Then we change the status property to the new status, set the icon based on the status resources icon, and set the label. And this is the interesting bit. We get the status resources tooltip with the get tooltip method. And for tooltips, like the power one, the true strength form, it will be just the text one by one, right? But in the case of muscle or exposed, we'll get that dynamic tooltip because we made sure that in those methods, we actually replace the placeholders like so, right? So this will return a string, and we set the label's text property to that string. And that's it. Pretty basic. So we can save this with Ctrl S. And if we want to test it, we can go back to 2D view and use one of those statuses, for example, the muscle, and run the scene. And it says attacks deal 2 more damage. Awesome. So this %s was replaced. And indeed, when we open this muscle.theory, the default number of stacks is 2. So if I bump this up to 10 and run the scene again, it will say 10 more damage. Awesome. So that's all we really need from the status tooltip. With that export variable working, we can sort of just revert this to be empty because we'll do this from code anyway. Right. So that's one scene done, but we need another one. And that other one will be the status view. So click on the plus sign again. And this time the root node will be a basic control node. So click on user interface, double click and rename this to status view. Then we can add some child nodes to this. So click on the plus sign or press Ctrl A. First of all, we'll add a color rect as a background. Click on the anchor presets and set it to full rect. Change the color from white to black maybe. And set the alpha to whatever you like. If you want to make it like transparent, something like that. Zoom in a bit. Yeah, we can rename this to background. And make sure that we actually can't click on this, right? We don't want to click on this because we want the status view, the control node, to be the one handling the clicks, because that's the root node we'll have the script attached to. If you remember, we've been screwed a couple of times by color rects, because by default they stop mouse filter events. So instead of stop, we'll set this to ignore. Right. Another node we need here is, by clicking on the plus sign, is a scroll container. Because it can happen during the game that you have so many status effects on a target that you can't actually fit them into one screen. You can set the layout to something like 200 by 100 maybe. Yeah, that's big enough for me. And actually use an anchor preset to center this on the screen. And we can turn off horizontal scrolling, I think. Disabled or never show works perfectly fine. We only want to scroll this on the vertical axis. Inside the scroll container, we need to add another one. That's why we have this warning here saying that it's intended to work with a single child control. Use a container as a child. Okay, so click on the plus sign. What kind of container we want to use with this? Well, I just kind of want the status tooltips to be under each other, but I also want this to be centered on all of the axes. So we'll use a center container for this one. And for the center container itself, we can go under layout and container sizing and fill all the available space on the horizontal and vertical axes. And the status tooltips themselves shouldn't be put under a center container, but we can create another container child under this one. And this one will be a VBox, right? Just display all the status tooltips on top and under each other. So we'll use a VBox container. And actually we can rename this by double clicking on it and calling it something like status tooltips. And this node will have all our tooltips. And we kind of want to access this from code because we want to change this, right? All the time when we click on the status view. So right click on this and enable access as unique name. So it's easier to reach it wherever we put it under the hierarchy. And if we want to see how this looks like, we can instantiate some status tooltips. So click on the instantiate child scene button and add a status tooltip. And we can duplicate this a bunch of times. And you can see that the scroll container works because when we clip through the available space, the scroll bar appears on the right. But it's kind of packed and I don't really like that. So in the status tooltips node, go to theme overrides, constants, and set a value you like for the separation. For me, something like 8 pixels looks much better, right? So we have some space, it's easier on the eyes, right? We kind of see that when we start to instantiate status tooltips from code, this will look just fine. So we can delete all these placeholders. We don't need them anymore. And one last thing we also want to add to the status view itself, the root node, clicking on the plus sign and Control A, is a button node. So we'll have a button to go back from this view. So the text can say something like back. And for the layout, we can set the minimum size to something like 50 pixels by 15. And make sure to reset the transform because it's way too tall. Actually spell it with a capital B because that's what I used to stay consistent. And let's move this over. Okay, so on the anchor preset, select the top right anchoring. And we can go into move mode by pressing W and maybe move it away from the borders a bit, like so. Go back to select mode by pressing Q and actually rename this to back button. And we still haven't saved the scene yet. So press Ctrl S to save this. Status view is perfectly fine. And see how we can code this logic by attaching a script to the status view, the root node. Click on the attach script button, create the new script. And before we start coding, again, to avoid typos, let's connect the signals we want to this script. So if the status view itself is selected, go to node, signals, and connect the GUI input event. On GUI input is perfectly fine. And we also want to connect the button press. So select the back button and the press signal, double click on that one and connect that signal too. Okay, with the signals connected, let's see how we can code this. Okay, so first of all, we'll provide a custom class name called statusView. Then we'll have a constant called statusTooltip where we preload the other scene we just did, that HBox container with the icon and the tooltip. So we can instantiate it whenever we want to. Then we'll have an already variable reference to that statusTooltips VBox container where we actually want to instantiate those tooltips. In the ready callback, just to make sure, when the game loads, we iterate through all the children of the statusTooltips VBox container and delete all the statusTooltips we have. We currently don't have any, but if you leave them in for like visual purposes to see how it looks like, we can just safely delete it in the ready callback. Then in the input event callback, when we press UI cancel and the status view is visible, meaning we want to close it, we call the hide view method, which we are yet to implement. Then before implementing that hide view, we actually have the contour part of that, which is show view. And for this one, we need an array of statuses, which are the statuses we want to display. So for example, when we click on the status effects under the player, then we can grab an array of statuses the player currently has and pass it as an argument to this show view method. And then what we can do is we can iterate through all of those status resources, create a new status tooltip for each of those, and add it as a child to our status tooltips node, right? And when we are done with all the statuses and all of them are added, then we can call the show method to make sure that the status view actually becomes visible. Contrary to that, when we actually want to hide that status view, what we do is we delete all the children we have because we won't be needing them anymore. If we want to view them again, we have to instantiate new ones because the dynamic values might need to be changed anyways, right? So after deleting all the current status tooltips, we need to call the hide method as well to make sure that the status view becomes invisible. Right. So what do we want to do with the two callbacks? We have the GUI input and the back button pressed one. So in the case of GUI input, if the status view itself, the control node, picks up a left mouse click and it is visible, then we want to call the hide view method to close it. And when the back button is pressed, we just want to close it anyways. So we call the hide view method. Okay, so that's all the logic we need for the status view itself, but where and how do we call this show view method? Well, think about this for a second. Where in the game we want to initiate this behavior? I want this to happen when I click on a status handler, which is under a player or under one of the enemies, right? These are pretty far away from the scene tree, from the separate canvas layer where we'll actually instantiate that status view. And when they are that far away from each other, probably the cleanest solution is to create a new event in the EventBus and connect to that signal or that special event here, right? So let's just go ahead and go with that solution because I think that's the cleanest and the easiest one in this case. So let's press Ctrl-Alt-O and search for events.gd, and we'll add a new signal under maybe the battle related events. I think that's the best place for it. Why? Well, because it's neither player related, neither enemy related, right? Because it's related to both of them. It's not card related at all. So I think it makes sense to say that it's battle related because battle sort of involves both the player and the enemy, right? So here we can create a new signal called status tooltip requested, and we have one parameter which is pretty important. That's the array of status resources we want to display. So if we save this and go back to the status view, now we can connect to that event. And in the ready function or the ready callback, it's pretty easy to do so. We just say that events.statustooltip.requested.connect. And we have our show view method where the signature or the amount of parameters and the type of parameters are matching, right? We expect an array of statuses. And in the events.gd, we say that an array of statuses needs to be passed when this signal is emitted. Cool. So basically that's all we need from the status view, and the whole system is ready to work except for one little thing, and it's again UI related. So let's go back to 2D view. And if you remember, I said that, okay, for the background, it's a pretty good idea to say that we set the mouse filter to ignore to make sure that this doesn't consume the click and the status view can pick up that click, right? Well, yes, and that's still true, but I forgot to set the mouse event for this one. Fortunately for us, it's set to stop by default for control nodes, but we need to make this sure every time we work with UI, right? Okay, so this will consume the event and the GUI input is connected, so we're good to go. Okay, now we actually need to hook this up. So where do we do this? Well, obviously in the battle scene. So let's press Ctrl-Shift-O, search for battle.tscn. And here we have a bunch of nodes and canvas layers already. We have a layer for battle UI, the red flash, the battle overlay, and the card pile views. We could certainly use either of these. Probably the battle UI would be the best place, but this is on layer 1. And when you want to sort of see the status effects, I want this to render on top of everything else, just like the card pile views do. And that's on layer 4. So I think the cleanest way to do this, even if our scene tree becomes bigger and bigger, is to create a new canvas layer for this. So let's select the root node, the battle node, click on the plus sign, search for canvas layer, set the layer to layer 4. It's the same as with card pile views. Double click and rename this to status view layer. And under status view layer, the only thing we need to do is to click on the instantiate child scene button or press Ctrl-Shift-A and search for StatusView.gd. And you see that we have our little thing here on top of everything else, but we can hide it by default. It doesn't need to be visible. We can save this with Ctrl-S And the only thing we really need to do is to actually emit the new signal we have, right? Because the status view is connected to the status tooltip requested event, but we don't emit it anywhere in the project. So where and how do we want to emit this? We want to emit this when we click on a status handler. So let's open up a status handler in 2D view. So let's go back, press Ctrl+Shift-O and search for status handler.tscn. Okay, so this is our grid container. And we want to, whenever we click on this, we'll display all of the available statuses on that individual. So in order to detect clicking on this, what we want to do is go to mouse and see the filter by default is pass in this case. So we want to set this to stop to make sure that we can actually detect or intercept clicking on this. Then when we're done with that, we actually want to go to node and signals and connect the GUI input event now that we can recognize clicking on this one. So click on connect. And you can see that now we can click on it. We have this connection to the GUI input event. So what do we want to do here? First of all, we'll check if the event or the input event action is the left mouse button pressed, right? And if it is, we can request that new signal from the EventBus that status tooltip requested, and to pass on the current array of status resources, we can call our getAllStatuses method. Pretty easy, right? That's all we need from the status handler. Now there's just one tiny little problem. It's the same thing with UIs over and over again. If we go back to the status handler, we said that it's a grid container and we want to be able to detect clicking on it. We connected that signal and we set the mouse filter to stop. Right, let's think about this for a second though. What kind of children we'll have under the status handler? Well, we have a scene called status UI, right? We want to instantiate those in the status handler. So let's press Ctrl+Shift-O and search for status UI. Indeed, we have a scene like this. And if we open that up, see, the problem lies here. If we click on the status UI control node, it's a control node. So the mouse filter will be set to stop on it by default, and that's a problem. Because if I click on one specific status UI and not the space between them in the grid, then the status handler cannot pick up that mouse signal, so it won't emit the signal. And I don't want this. I want only the status handler to handle all the clicking, not the individual statuses. So what we need to do here is to make sure that the status UI itself will have the mouse filter set to ignore. And just to be sure, we can check all the other ones. And for the texture rect, it will be set to pass, which is fine. And for the labels, I think they won't be a problem either because these are by default set to ignore. Okay, so promise, that was the last UI thing we need to change. And we have our whole status tooltip system in place. So if we go ahead and play the game now, start a new game, let's see if I can, yeah, it's perfect. I have my power here. So if I end my turn, at the start of my next turn, I have 3 statuses active, right? So if I click on any of those, it will open this new window and I have 3 explanations. And you can see that the magic numbers kind of do their thing because expose says takes 50% more damage for 1 turn. Even though the grammar is off, it still works, right? For the true strength form, it just displays the text as is because there's no magic numbers involved. But for the muscle, it says that my attacks deal 2 more damage. Awesome. So if I play my turn here, you can see that I deal 8 damage with this attack. Indeed I do. Take 5. The exposed expires. It goes back to 7. And if I click on the status effects now, I only have 2 of those showing anymore. And you can see that the muscle indeed updates at every turn. Pretty cool. So I can do massive damage to the crab enemy. And if I play that exposed one, you can see that it still works for the enemy as well. So if I click on this one, it says that it takes 50% more damage for 2 turns. If I click on my own one, it still works, and the muscle says it deals 6 more damage, right? So I can end my turn. The muscle goes to 8 now. I can close it with S or by clicking on the black screen. And if I end another turn, the muscle goes to 10, but the exposed expired on the crab enemy. So I can no longer click on it. And I can kill that crab and everything works as intended. Awesome. I think that's probably one of the hardest episodes in the whole series, and the rest of the season will be much easier. Maybe the relics are a bit challenging, but not as challenging as this one, I think. So if you managed to do everything, good job, keep up, learn a lot, have fun, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.